The conference room fell silent as I stared at the resume in my hands. Sarah Mitchell, 58, applying for a receptionist position. My hands trembled slightly as I recognized the familiar handwriting on the cover letter, the same handwriting that had signed my report cards with disappointed sighs for 18 years. After 3 decades of being called her biggest disappointment, my mother was sitting in the lobby downstairs, waiting to interview for a job at the company I now owned. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same woman who told me I'd never amount to anything was now desperate enough to work for the daughter she'd spent years tearing down. But let me back up, because this story doesn't begin with power or success. It begins with a 16-year-old girl standing in a kitchen, holding her first paycheck from McDonald's, while her mother crushed her spirit with 8 simple words: "At least you're finally contributing something to this family." Growing up in suburban Cleveland, Ohio, I learned early that nothing I did would ever be good enough for Sarah Mitchell. While my friends' mothers celebrated their children's achievements, mine found fault in everything. When I made honor roll, she'd ask why I wasn't valedictorian. When I got promoted to shift manager at my part-time job, she'd wonder aloud why I couldn't find real work like my cousin Jennifer, who worked at a bank. Even when I graduated high school with a 3.8 GPA and a full scholarship to Ohio State, her first comment was about how I should have applied to better schools. The worst part wasn't the constant criticism. It was the way she'd dismiss my dreams with a casual cruelty that took my breath away. I wanted to study business and marketing, but she'd laugh and say I didn't have the personality for sales. When I talked about starting my own company someday, she'd shake her head and mutter about pipe dreams and getting my head out of the clouds. Her favorite phrase became my personal soundtrack: "You're just not built for success, honey. Some people are leaders and some people are followers. You're definitely a follower." By the time I turned 18, I'd internalized every cruel word. I believed I was mediocre, destined for a life of settling for less. When I moved out for college, I was so desperate to prove her wrong that I worked 3 part-time jobs while maintaining a full course load. I'd call home excited about a good grade or a promotion at work, only to have her respond with lukewarm acknowledgement followed by a story about someone else's superior achievements. "That's nice, dear," she'd say, "but did you hear that Jennifer just got promoted to assistant manager? Now that's real success." The breaking point came during my junior year of college. I'd been working for a local marketing firm as an intern, and they offered me a paid position with real responsibilities. I was over the moon. Finally, someone saw potential in me. I called my mother immediately, practically vibrating with excitement as I told her about the opportunity. There was a long pause before she responded, and when she did, her voice carried that familiar tone of disappointment that had haunted my childhood. "Oh, Emily," she sighed, "you're going to embarrass yourself. Marketing isn't for people like us. We're not smooth talkers or natural salespeople. You'll probably last 6 months before they realize you're not cut out for it." That phone call changed everything. I remember hanging up and staring at my dorm room wall, feeling that familiar ache in my chest where her words had landed like physical blows. But something was different this time. Instead of the usual spiral of self-doubt, I felt a spark of anger. Not the hot, explosive kind, but a cold, determined fury that settled in my bones and whispered, "She's wrong." For the first time in my life, I didn't believe her. I looked at myself in the mirror and made a promise that would shape the next 15 years of my life. I would prove her wrong, not to win her approval, but to prove to myself that I was worth more than her limited vision of who I could be. That spark of defiance carried me through the rest of college and into my early career, but the road wasn't easy. My mother's voice had taken up permanent residence in my head, questioning every decision and predicting failure at every turn. When I graduated summa cum laude with my business degree, she attended the ceremony but spent most of the reception telling relatives about Jennifer's engagement to a doctor. When I landed my first real job at a prestigious marketing firm in Columbus, making more money than she'd ever seen, she worried aloud that I was getting too big for my britches and that pride comes before a fall. The pattern continued for years. Every promotion, every success, every step forward was met with skepticism disguised as maternal concern. When I bought my first car, a modest Honda Civic that I'd saved for months to afford, she inspected it with a critical eye and wondered if I could really afford the payments. When I moved into my own apartment, she toured it making comments about how expensive everything looked and how I should be saving money instead of showing off. It was as if she couldn't bear to see me succeed, as if my achievements somehow diminished her own worth. The manipulation was subtle but constant. She'd call me at work during important meetings, claiming family emergencies that turned out to be minor inconveniences. She'd schedule family gatherings during my business trips, then guilt me for choosing work over family. When I started dating seriously, she'd find fault with every boyfriend. Michael was too ambitious and would probably cheat on me with someone more successful. David was too laid back and would drag me down. James was perfect on paper, but probably had hidden problems because men that good-looking always do. But it was the financial manipulation that hurt the most. Despite earning a decent salary, I was constantly loaning money to my mother for various crises. Her car needed repairs, her mortgage payment was late, she had unexpected medical bills. Each time, she'd promise to pay me back, but somehow there was always another emergency before she could. When I finally worked up the courage to ask about the money, nearly $15,000 over 3 years, she looked at me with wounded eyes and said, "I can't believe you're keeping track. I gave you life, Emily. I fed you and clothed you for 18 years. Don't you think that's worth something?" The gaslighting was masterful. Whenever I tried to set boundaries or express frustration, she'd flip the script. I was ungrateful. I was selfish. I was too sensitive and couldn't take a joke. She'd bring up my childhood struggles, how I was a difficult baby, how I gave her stretch marks, how I was expensive to raise. She'd remind me of every mistake I'd ever made, every time she'd helped me, every sacrifice she'd supposedly made for my sake. By the end of these conversations, I'd be apologizing for bringing up my concerns and promising to do better as a daughter. The worst part was how she'd undermine my confidence in professional settings. She'd show up to my office Christmas parties and introduce herself to my colleagues with stories about my childhood mishaps. "Oh, you work with Emily," she'd say with a laugh. "Did she ever tell you about the time she tried to make cookies and set the kitchen on fire? She's always been a disaster in the kitchen. I don't know how she manages to run marketing campaigns if she can't even follow a simple recipe." She thought she was being funny, but I could see my coworkers' expressions change, could feel their perception of me shift from competent professional to someone whose own mother didn't take her seriously. The breaking point came when I was 28 and had just been promoted to marketing director at a major firm. It was the biggest achievement of my career, and I'd worked 60-hour weeks for months to earn it. I called my mother, foolishly hoping that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this accomplishment would finally be big enough to earn her pride. The conversation started well enough. She congratulated me and asked about the salary increase. But then she paused, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in her head. "You know, honey," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about making a career change. This recession has been hard on everyone, and I could really use a steady job with benefits. Do you think your company might have any openings? Nothing fancy, just something stable. I mean, if you have any pull there now with your new position." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Here I was, finally achieving something meaningful, and she was already figuring out how to benefit from it. Not how to celebrate it, not how to support it, but how to use it for her own gain. When I gently suggested that it might be awkward for us to work at the same company, she accused me of being ashamed of her. "I raised you better than this," she said, her voice taking on that wounded tone that always made me feel guilty. I guess success really does change people. I just never thought my own daughter would become too good for her own mother. That night, I sat in my new corner office, the office I'd dreamed of since college, and cried. Not tears of joy for my promotion, but tears of frustration and exhaustion. I was tired of every achievement being overshadowed by her needs, tired of every conversation being about what I could do for her rather than celebrating what I'd accomplished for myself. I was tired of being made to feel guilty for succeeding when success was supposedly what she'd always wanted for me. Most of all, I was tired of the little girl inside me who still desperately wanted her mother's approval, even though I knew by now that approval would never come. The next 5 years were a whirlwind of career growth and personal development, but my mother's presence loomed over every achievement like a storm cloud. I'd learned to gray rock our conversations, giving minimal responses, sharing nothing important, protecting my victories from her inevitable criticism. But she sensed the distance and ramped up her efforts to insert herself into my life. The guilt trips became more frequent, the financial emergencies more dramatic, and the emotional manipulation more sophisticated. When I turned 33, something shifted inside me. I'd been seeing a therapist for 2 years, finally beginning to understand the depth of psychological damage my mother had inflicted. Dr. Martinez helped me recognize the patterns, how my mother's narcissistic tendencies had shaped my entire worldview, how I'd been conditioned to minimize my own needs and maximize hers. "Emily," she said during one particularly difficult session, "you've spent your entire adult life trying to earn love from someone who's incapable of giving it. Your mother doesn't see you as a separate person with your own dreams and goals. She sees you as an extension of herself, existing solely to meet her needs." The revelation was both liberating and terrifying. For the first time, I began to see my mother's behavior not as tough love or high standards, but as abuse. Emotional abuse, financial abuse, psychological manipulation, all wrapped in the socially acceptable package of a concerned mother. I started setting small boundaries. I stopped lending money. I limited our phone calls to once a week. I stopped sharing details about my work life. Each boundary was met with escalating pushback, tears, accusations, threats to cut me out of her life entirely. "You're breaking your mother's heart," she'd sob. "I don't know what happened to my sweet little girl. You've become so cold and selfish." But the boundaries held, and for the first time in my adult life, I had mental space to focus entirely on my career. The results were immediate and dramatic. Without the constant drain of my mother's crises and criticism, my performance soared. I spearheaded 3 major campaigns that brought in millions in revenue. I was headhunted by competitors offering substantial raises. Most importantly, I'd saved enough money to start my own consulting firm, the dream I'd harbored since college, but never felt confident enough to pursue. Mitchell Marketing Solutions launched on a crisp October morning in 2019, operating out of a small office space in downtown Columbus. I'd chosen to keep my maiden name for the business, partly for branding consistency, partly because I wanted to prove that a Mitchell could build something meaningful. The irony of sharing my mother's surname wasn't lost on me, but I was determined to redefine what it meant to be a Mitchell. Starting with a team of 3, myself and 2 talented junior marketers I'd poached from my previous firm, we focused on helping small to medium businesses develop authentic brand stories. The timing couldn't have been better. As social media marketing exploded and traditional advertising became less effective, companies were desperate for authentic connection with their customers. Our approach, focusing on genuine storytelling rather than manipulative tactics, resonated powerfully in the market. Within 18 months, we'd grown to 15 employees and had a waiting list of potential clients. By 2022, we were handling marketing for some of Ohio's most recognizable brands, and I'd been featured on the cover of Columbus Business Magazine as one of the city's top entrepreneurs under 40. Through all of this growth and success, I maintained strict no contact with my mother. She'd tried various tactics to break through, showing up at my old apartment, calling my friends, even contacting my former employers to check on my well-being. But I held firm. The peace was intoxicating. For the first time in my life, I could celebrate my achievements without immediately bracing for criticism. I could make decisions without second-guessing every choice. I could fail at something without hearing her voice telling me she'd predicted it all along. The success of my company attracted media attention, and with it came a level of visibility I hadn't anticipated. Local news stations featured stories about our innovative campaigns. Industry publications wrote about our rapid growth. The Columbus Chamber of Commerce honored me as their Young Business Leader of the Year. Each accolade felt like a small victory against every person who'd ever doubted my potential, but especially against the voice of my mother that had lived in my head for so long. It was during this period of professional triumph that I met David Chin, a brilliant software developer who'd started his own tech company around the same time I'd launched mine. Unlike the men I'd dated in my 20s, relationships sabotaged by my mother's interference and my own insecurities, David saw me clearly. He celebrated my ambition instead of feeling threatened by it. He understood the demands of entrepreneurship because he lived them too. When he proposed after 2 years of dating, I said yes without the slightest hesitation. For the first time, I was choosing love without seeking anyone's approval but my own. Our wedding was small and intimate, exactly what we both wanted. I felt a pang of sadness that my mother wasn't there, but it was overshadowed by relief. There were no snide comments about my dress, no passive-aggressive remarks about the catering, no attempts to redirect attention to herself. Instead, there were only people who genuinely celebrated our happiness, who saw our love as something beautiful rather than something to be criticized or controlled. As I danced with my new husband under string lights in the garden of our favorite restaurant, I realized this was what joy felt like when it wasn't filtered through someone else's dysfunction. But even as I built this new life, filled with success and genuine love, I couldn't shake the feeling that the other shoe would drop eventually. My mother was too narcissistic to simply disappear from my life forever. She was biding her time, waiting for the right moment to insert herself back into my world. I just never imagined that moment would come in the form of a job application landing on my desk on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. Staring at that resume, I felt like I was 16 again, small and powerless under her disapproving gaze. But this time was different. This time, I held all the cards. My assistant knocked gently on my door. "Ms. Mitchell? Your 2 p.m. interview is here." I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward what I knew would be the most important conversation of my life. She was sitting in our sleek reception area, looking older than I remembered, but still carrying herself with that familiar air of barely contained criticism. Her eyes swept over our office space, the modern furniture, the awards on the walls, the busy hum of a successful business, and I saw something I'd never seen before in her expression: genuine surprise. She'd found my company online, of course, but seeing it in person was different. This wasn't the failure she'd predicted. This was real, substantial success, and she couldn't dismiss it or minimize it. "Hello, Mother," I said quietly. She startled, clearly not expecting me to be the one conducting the interview. Her face cycled through emotions: shock, embarrassment, calculation, and finally, that practiced smile she used when she needed something. "Emily, oh my goodness, I had no idea this was your company. What a wonderful surprise." but her voice carried that forced cheerfulness that had always preceded her most manipulative performances. I led her to the conference room, my heart pounding but my expression calm. As we sat across from each other at the polished table where I'd closed million-dollar deals, the power dynamic was unmistakable. She was the one needing something now. She was the one whose future depended on my decision. So, I said, opening her application, "Tell me why you're interested in working here." What followed was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. She spoke about always being proud of my success, about wanting to be part of something meaningful, about how family should stick together. She conveniently forgot every cruel word, every dismissive comment, every time she'd predicted my failure. When I remained silent, she shifted tactics. "I know we've had our differences, honey, but I'm your mother. I love you. I've always wanted what's best for you, even if my delivery wasn't perfect." "Your delivery," I repeated slowly. "Is that what we're calling it?" The question hung in the air between us. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face. She was used to me backing down, used to me absorbing her rewriting of history. But I wasn't that scared little girl anymore. I leaned back in my chair in my company, in the life I'd built despite her constant sabotage, and spoke the words I'd been rehearsing in therapy for years. "Do you remember what you said to me when I got promoted to marketing director? You asked if I could get you a job. Not congratulations, not celebration, just immediately thinking about what my success could do for you. Do you remember what you said when I told you I was starting my own company? You laughed and said I'd be bankrupt within a year because I didn't have what it takes." Her face flushed, but she tried to maintain her composure. "I was just trying to protect you from disappointment. The business world is tough, and I didn't want to see you get hurt." The gaslighting was automatic, reflexive, but it no longer had the power to make me doubt my own memories. "No," I said firmly. "You were trying to keep me small because my success threatened your narrative about yourself. You needed me to fail to justify your own limitations. You needed me to be your disappointment because if I succeeded, you'd have to face the fact that you were the problem, not me." The mask finally slipped. Her practiced expression cracked, revealing the rage underneath. "How do you speak to me like this? I'm your mother. I sacrificed everything for you. I worked 2 jobs to put food on the table, and this is how you repay me? By throwing my struggles in my face. You worked jobs you hated and blamed me for it," I replied calmly. "You made me feel guilty for existing, for having needs, for taking up space in your life. And now you want to work for the company I built, the company you said would fail. You want me to give you the stability and benefits you never thought I was capable of earning for myself." The conference room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. She stared at me with a mixture of fury and something that might have been fear. For 35 years, she'd been the powerful one in our relationship. She'd been the one who decided my worth, who controlled the narrative, who held the emotional cards. Now, for the first time, she needed something from me that she couldn't manipulate or guilt her way into getting. "I'm not going to hire you," I said quietly. "Not because you're not qualified. The position is entry-level, and you could probably do the work. I'm not hiring you because having you here would be toxic for me, for my employees, and ultimately for you. You can't celebrate other people's success when it makes you feel small. You can't build others up when you're committed to tearing them down." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You think you're so successful, so important, but you're still just my disappointing daughter who's too good for her own family. When this all falls apart, and it will, don't come crying to me." I watched her gather her purse and storm toward the door, and instead of the familiar stab of guilt and self-doubt, I felt something else entirely: relief. Pure, clean relief. "Goodbye, Mother," I said to her retreating figure. "I hope you find what you're looking for, but you won't find it here." After she left, I sat alone in the conference room for a long time, processing what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "How did the big meeting go?" I smiled, thinking about how to explain that I'd just fired my mother from a job she never had, and somehow it felt like the most professional decision I'd ever made. That evening, I came home to the life I'd built, a husband who celebrated my successes, a home filled with warmth instead of criticism, a future limited only by my own imagination rather than someone else's fears. As I told David about the interview, I realized something profound had shifted. The little girl inside me who'd been desperately seeking her mother's approval had finally grown up. She'd looked her mother in the eye and chosen herself instead. My company continued to thrive. We expanded to Cincinnati and Cleveland, eventually growing to over 50 employees. I was featured in Forbes as one of the top female entrepreneurs in the Midwest. None of these achievements came with the shadow of anticipated criticism or the fear of not being good enough. They came with pure joy, the kind of joy that's only possible when you're free to define success for yourself. I never heard from my mother again. Sometimes I wonder if she tells people about her successful daughter, conveniently leaving out the part where she predicted my failure at every turn. But mostly, I don't think about her at all. I'm too busy building the life she said I wasn't capable of having, surrounded by people who see my worth instead of my shortcomings. If you're reading this and you recognize your own story and mine, please know this: you are not the disappointment they told you that you were. You are not responsible for managing their emotions or validating their choices. You have the right to succeed without guilt, to celebrate without permission, and to build a life that reflects your own values rather than their limitations. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for them and for yourself, is to stop trying to earn love from people who aren't capable of giving it freely. The little girl who believed she was a disappointment grew up to become a woman who disappointed no one more than she disappointed the people who tried to keep her small. And you know what? That's exactly the kind of disappointment I'm proud to be.